Ladies and gentlemen, hello. My name is Martin Gold. I am presently a partner with the firm of Capital Counsel, but I was for many years head of the legislative practice at Covington and Burling, a major Washington, D.C. law firm. And while I was there, I acted as pro bono counsel, heading up a team on behalf of major Chinese American organizations. Those organizations had in mind to secure resolutions from the Senate and the House of Representatives to express the regret of Congress for the passage of the Chinese exclusion laws, a body of highly discriminatory legislation that worked its way through Congress in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It had a bearing on the immigration of persons of Chinese descent to the United States, as well as the naturalization of such persons. We were, in our efforts, successful. In 2011, we passed a resolution through the Senate. In 2012, a resolution through the House. So I'm pleased to tell you that it's a sad story, this is, with a happy ending. I can say personally that no work that I have ever done in my career, and that has been a long career, well over 50 years in Washington, has ever brought me the satisfaction that I got from this work. So what I want to do now is to tell you the story of the Chinese exclusion laws from the perspective of Congress. Obviously, people speaking from the perspective of the community could have additional details and additional texture to add to the story, but that would be a discussion for another day. The picture that you see on the screen right now is the cover of a book that I wrote in 2012, which is a very long and detailed legislative history that we're going to cover in this PowerPoint. So I want to begin now before the beginning, and I want to go back to the year 1870. And the Naturalization Act that passed in that year. In the very first Congress of the United States, in 1790, Congress passed a naturalization law. Who could become an American citizen? And in 1790, the law said expressly that only white people could be naturalized. Well, in the ensuing time, we had the Civil War, and we had the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments ratified into the US Constitution. It is time, clearly time, to update the law, and that is what Congress is trying to do in 1870. A naturalization bill goes through the House of Representatives to update the law. It comes to the Senate on the afternoon of Saturday, July 2nd, 1870. This senator, Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, rises and offers an amendment. Here is the amendment: that all acts of Congress relating to naturalization be and the same are hereby amended by striking out the word white wherever it occurs, so that in naturalization there shall be no distinction of race or color. Charles Sumner was a noted abolitionist. He was a radical Republican. On the night that Abraham Lincoln died, he was at his bedside. Sumner believed strongly in the equality of races. And here you have a naturalization bill, and here you have this amendment saying no person in the United States may be denied the right of naturalization on the basis of race. The amendment passed. And when it did, a senator from Nevada named William Stewart rose. Stewart was one of the few members of Congress from the Pacific Coast, because the Pacific Coast was very lightly populated then. California had 6 electoral votes. Nevada, where Stewart was from, had 3. Oregon had 3. That's it. He was concerned about 100,000 Chinese on the Pacific coast of the United States. Some had come for the gold rush. Many more had come to build the transcontinental railway. Many had stayed. What if these people actually decided to become American citizens? What would that do to the body politic of the West Coast? What would it do to the ability to attract white labor to the West Coast? So Stewart was not about to allow the naturalization of these Chinese people. And he stood on the floor and said, that amendment must come out of this bill, or this bill will not pass. He threatened a filibuster. Early July 1870, but Congress is looking to a July 15th adjournment. That's a tough circumstance, because at the end of any Congress, there is always a lot of legislation in the queue waiting for passage. And now Stewart has got a blockade going. Well, they asked Stewart to desist. He refuses. The Senate did not work on Sunday, July the 3rd, but they were back on the 4th of July to work until late into the evening. And Stewart still will not desist. Now, he has a little bit of help, but he's the ringleader of this. And so finally, in order to break the logjam, the Senate reconsiders the vote by which Sumner's amendment passed, pulls it out of the bill, adds before final passage an amendment that allowed people of African descent to naturalize. That passed by one vote, and then the bill was closed. Now, by the way, the Africans in question were people who were born in Africa and who had come to the United States because if they had been native born in this country, former slaves, they would have qualified for birthright citizenship under the 14th Amendment, which was by then law. So it wasn't the people who were born here, it was the people who came here. Nonetheless, they were allowed. After it was over, one of the senators who had supported Sumner said, well, we knew that the Chinese provision was controversial for some people, so we decided we would take it up in two segments. First, we would deal with the Africans, and then we would deal with the Chinese. And that is, in fact, what happened. But the trouble is, the two segments were 73 years apart. No person of Chinese descent born anywhere in the world other than in the United States itself could become an American citizen until the Chinese exclusion laws were finally repealed in 1943. Think about the impact of the history of Chinese in America at this moment. What if the Sumner Amendment had passed and these folks had been citizens and voters? During the years when the Chinese exclusion policy was enacted, which is really the period 1882 to 1904, and for a number of years thereafter, America still welcomed Europeans. My grandfather, for example, from what is now present-day Belarus, but was in the day the Tsarist Empire, was one of those Europeans. He came to this country at the very end of 1907, the peak year of immigration to America. He was 20 years old. He had no English and not particularly important skills. He worked in the garment industry in New York while he learned English at night. And when he finally was here long enough to qualify for American citizenship, he became a citizen as soon as he possibly could and enjoyed the benefits of citizenship for the rest of his life. He had a 50-year love affair with the United States. Now, he had all those opportunities because he was a European. Had he been Chinese at the very moment in 1907 that he arrived, he probably would never have been let in the first place. And if he had been allowed in under some narrow exception or administrative reading of the law, he still could not have aspired to American citizenship. I understood what it meant to my grandfather to be an American citizen. We were quite close when I was a child. I knew what it meant. And when people say to me, well, you're not Chinese, why were you interested in this? I can give you a simple explanation. I thought that what was good enough for my grandfather should have been good enough for them. It wasn't, and that was wrong. And so to find some way of addressing that wrong was a very easy emotional and psychological thing for me to do. And as I mentioned before, very rewarding, not because I got paid anything for it, which we didn't, but because of the emotional response to this entire situation. We're going to talk about three periods of laws. Pre-1882, which is period 1868 to 1882, then the original Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, and then what happened in the years thereafter, because once Congress got going on this subject, they went back to it again and again and again until they made it permanent in 1904. But before we have exclusion, we have welcome in this country. Again, the first Chinese came during the California Gold Rush. Others came because of the Transcontinental Railway. They came without legal agreements in place. But in 1868, the United States negotiated something called the Burlingame Treaty with China. Now, if you think about the early Western treaties with China, the Chinese always will complain about that and say, well, they were the unequal treaties. But this is not one of them. This is a treaty negotiated by Anson Burlingame, who had represented the United States to China, and in this moment was representing China to the United States. The Burlingame Treaty of 1868 provided for the free and voluntary movement of peoples between China and the United States. And it did something else. It affirmed that the Chinese in America would be granted all of the rights associated to citizens of the most favored nation. A most favored nation is a concept, a terminology used in trade law, but in this case, what it means is that the privileges and immunities that were available to somebody, for example, who had immigrated from England or from France, would also be available to somebody who came from China. So there's the Burlingame Treaty, and at first it works just fine. There's strong support for the treaty. This is a photograph of Secretary of State Hamilton Fish, who was the secretary under President Ulysses Grant. And in early 1869, he makes this statement that every month brings thousands of Chinese immigrants to the Pacific Coast. By their assiduity, patience, and fidelity, and by their intelligence, they earn the goodwill and the confidence of those who employ them. So they are welcome in this country. They are welcome in this country because they are filling a void in the labor force, and they are adding something to American society. And then we have a problem. Because by the early 1870s, the economy in America changes. There's a deep recession, even a depression by 1873, and now jobs are scarce. Now there's competition in California, specifically between Chinese labor and white labor for scarce jobs. Now all of a sudden people aren't so happy to see new immigrants come anymore. They can undercut the wages of white labor, and they begin to agitate for exclusion and restriction. Court cases told California that this was a federal matter, that they couldn't just do it on their own, so they began to agitate the Congress. Congress does not respond immediately, but after a few years' time, they decide to send a commission of congressional members to California. So it is headed by a senator from Indiana named Oliver Morton. And in 1876, surveying the circumstances on the Pacific Coast, he basically says, these Chinese have no rights. They're not represented in the legislature. They're not represented in Congress. They don't have a vote. In those circumstances, they are subject to being ostracized, to being discriminated against. Unscrupulous enemies will come after them. the law will be insufficient to screen them from persecution. He called for Congress to remedy it, but the call goes on deaf ears. Why is it so? How does an issue that was really localized on the Pacific Coast become a matter for Congress to address in a fashion opposite to what Senator Morton was recommending? The way to think about it deals with American politics writ large. When the southern states were reconstructed into the Union, the Electoral College became exceptionally close, and the vote became exceptionally close because those states voted overwhelmingly against the party of Lincoln. So, in the election of 1876, the winner of the popular vote and the winner of the electoral vote were different. The same thing nearly happened in 1880. The election of 84 was close. Again, in 1888, the winner of the popular vote and the Electoral College was different, and the election was exceptionally close in 1892. So 5 successive elections, you had very close outcomes. And with very close outcomes, you're going to scrape for every electoral vote you can get. In the 1876 election, there were 185 electors for the winner, Rutherford Hayes, and 184 for the loser, Samuel Tilden. Every vote may matter. And even though California, Oregon, and Nevada were not highly populated, taken together, they have a dozen electoral votes. Maybe they'll be decisive. So politicians begin to pay a lot of attention to what the people on the Pacific Coast want, because that could be decisive in a national election. That leads to the first piece of anti-Chinese legislation, the 1879 15-passenger bill. It's pretty simple. It's an immigration control measure. No vessel can dock in the United States if it has more than 15 Chinese passengers, kept on a separate manifest from the other passengers. It's an immigration control measure. But the president of the United States at that time was Rutherford Hayes, who you see in this picture. And President Hayes said, this proposal is inconsistent with the foreign policy commitments we have made under the Burlingame Treaty. And so on that basis, he vetoed it, and Congress did not override the veto. So the anti-Chinese legislation was stood aside. That said, Hayes understood what the sentiment of Congress was. And he appointed a special commission called the Angell Commission, A-N-G-E-L-L, to go to China to try to renegotiate the treaty in some fashion and to allow for limited restrictions. And so as a result of that, you got in 1880 the Angell Treaty, which permitted Congress to regulate, limit, or even suspend Chinese immigration for a reasonable time, although not to prohibit it. Chinese government didn't like that, but they went with it. And the treaty did something else too, which is that it allowed Chinese who were already in the United States to come and go back and forth to China with the rights accorded to citizens of the most favored nation. So if people were already legally here, they had free passage to go back and forth without restriction. That's the Angell Treaty. That's the sentiment of Congress. With the right now to restrict immigration, Congress went to work. And what they did in 1882, earlier in the year, like in March, they passed something called the 20-Year Chinese Exclusion Act. It suspended immigration of skilled and unskilled Chinese laborers for 20 years. That's a whole generation. It prohibited state and federal courts from naturalizing Chinese persons. Now, where did that come from? Why did they do that? Because didn't the Sumner Amendment fail years before? It had. But there was anecdotal evidence that courts in Massachusetts were naturalizing Chinese persons anyway. And under the full faith and credit provisions of the Constitution, courts in California would have to recognize what courts in Massachusetts had done. To make sure this could not happen again, a California congressman named Farley offered an amendment that said it couldn't happen again. Now, the amendment was part of this 20-year exclusion law. The law also provided for the return certificates for the Chinese who were legally in the United States to come and go as per the terms of the Angel Treaty. But this is not really consistent with reasonable restrictions on immigration. You've got a whole generation here. So the President of the United States, Chester Arthur, who you see here, President in 1882, vetoes this legislation, said this is still not consistent with our foreign policy. Well, the 20-year bill had passed the Senate 29 to 15, 32 senators not voting. I put these numbers up so you would see it was originally somewhat controversial. In the House, it had passed 167 to 66. And then when the veto override vote came up in the Senate, because the Senate was the house of origin for this bill, so it went back to the Senate first, the veto override failed. It got 29 to override, 21 against. They need 2/3. They don't have 2/3. Arthur's veto stands up. So therefore, the 20-year exclusion doesn't work. But Congress is not about to be deterred. So instead of that, they said, well, if you don't like 20 years, Mr. President, what about 10? They quickly came back with a 10-year exclusion bill that prohibited the naturalization, suspended immigration for 10 years instead of 20, granted the return certificates, and also, I think you can say, provided a framework for later laws that targeted Chinese immigrants. Arthur was not about to again resist the will of the Congress, and if he had, he probably would have been overridden. So he signed it into law May the 6th, 1882. When we hear the Chinese Exclusion Act, this is the legislation we are originally talking about. It's just that the body of legislation is not restricted to this one enactment. This is the first enactment, first time it becomes law. Target somebody for restriction. Had never been done before in America. After Congress got its mind around this question, it continued to pass legislation because now the policy is not an issue anymore. Now it's a law enforcement question. How can we keep the law from being evaded? What kind of further restrictions do we have to put on to make the law more effective? So the 10-year bill, as you will see by these numbers, really was not particularly controversial. And it started in the House. The Senate passed it with amendments. They sent the amendments back over to the House. The House just agreed by a voice vote. All in favor say aye. They agreed to it by a voice vote to agree to the Senate amendments, which is what got it sent down to President Arthur for signature. In 1884, Congress made its first tightening of the law, something sponsored by another California member named Barclay Henley. By the way, the party affiliation of these people is not particularly important because on the Pacific Coast, whether you were Republican or Democrat, you supported exclusion. It's not true for the country as a whole, which we'll get into, but on the Pacific Coast, regardless of whether you were a Republican or a Democrat, you supported exclusion. Well, Barclay Henley sponsors the tightening of the law. It extends exclusion to all persons of Chinese origin attempting to enter the country from anywhere in the world, not just from China. So if somebody went to Canada and tried to come in from Canada, they were excluded just as if they had come directly from China. And look at the vote here now. This is 184 to 13 with 125 not voting. There's probably some misgivings in there, but for people who were willing to go on the record, 184 to 13 means it's not so controversial anymore. There's the vote in the Senate. So now the law has been amended. Well, it's 1888. There's a lot of anti-Chinese violence in this country. Rock Springs, Tacoma, other places, Los Angeles. So what should be done about that? How can we have even more restrictive policies? The Bayard-Jung Treaty is a treaty that that the administration of President Grover Cleveland enters into with the Qing dynasty government in 1888. This is a treaty that is negotiated in the aftermath of repeated anti-Chinese violence. It proposes a 20-year ban on all Chinese worker immigration to the United States, very thing that had been vetoed a decade or so before, right? Less than a decade before. And then that was going to be okay, but the Senate, when it considered the treaty, has a right to make changes that may require renegotiation with the foreign government. And so the Senate added a couple of amendments that restricted the use of the return certificates. That did not sit well in China. So China refused to ratify the treaty. With the refusal, the question is, well, what should Congress do? Will it be hamstrung because China will refuse to ratify the treaty? Or should we just legislate notwithstanding the treaty? Because you're not really supposed to legislate in a way that's inconsistent with treaty obligations, as President Hayes had said, as President Arthur had said, but legally you can if you have a president that'll sign the measure. So Congress says, if we can't get China to agree by treaty, we'll do this unilaterally. Here comes the Scott Act of 1888. They acted unilaterally after China did not ratify Bayard-Jung, sponsored by a congressman named William Scott of Pennsylvania. They canceled the return certificates outright, not canceled them. There were 30,000 or so Chinese overseas at the time who had no way back, overrode the Angel Treaty. It passed the House by a voice vote and by the Senate 37-3. The president at the time was Grover Cleveland. You see him on the right, and on the left, you see the Secretary of State, Thomas Bayard, who had negotiated the treaty. Well, Bayard reported that China would not ratify Bayard-Jung. So Cleveland signed the Scott Act into law. Now you have legislation that contradicts treaty commitments, but it is American law and basically overrides the treaty that presently exists, which is the Angel Treaty. In 1892, the 10-year exclusion law is going to expire. What to be done? Certainly not repeal exclusion, no. So instead, the question is not whether exclusion should be extended or will be extended, it is how it will be extended, and it's going to be extended in a very tough form. So the Geary Act is sponsored by a California representative named Thomas Geary. It's going to extend exclusion for 10 more years. But this time, it's going to require Chinese people to carry certificates of residence. You have to prove that you are lawfully in the United States. You have to have your papers on you at all times. You can be stopped. You can be asked for your papers. If you don't have them, you are presumptively deportable. Presumptively deportable. So in that case, you go to court. You say, well, I don't have my papers, but I have witnesses that I am legally appropriate for being in the country. And I have my witnesses, here they are. But Congress mistrusted Chinese testimony. So they required that any Chinese testimony would have to be corroborated by one credible white witness. That's the text of the law. One credible white witness. And if you didn't get some judicial proceeding to override your presumptive deportation, you can be deported after you spent a year in prison. That's the Geary Act. Well, it becomes law. This is really very difficult. So a new treaty comes between China and the United States, the Gresham-Yang Treaty of 1894. It somewhat relaxes the ban on worker immigration back down to 10 years again. It permits the return certificates to be used, but not just by anybody. It can be used by returning Chinese immigrants with a family living in the US or property or debts owed of at least $1,000. And it made exemptions for 4 kinds of people or 5 kinds of people: officials of the Chinese government, tourists who aren't staying anyway, right? Students, teachers, and merchants. But these categories of teachers and merchants, which could be very broad, are going to be administratively interpreted very narrowly. So a teacher is not just a secondary school teacher. A teacher is a university specialist. A merchant is not a guy with a push cart. A merchant is a guy with a storefront. So these categories are interpreted administratively as restrictively as possible. And when the treaty went into effect, it replaced the Scott Act, which was a bone in the throat of China since it had been enacted 6 years earlier, because it allowed some use of return certificates to resume. The Gresham-Yang Treaty is in effect for up to 20 years, but it can be canceled by either government after 10. In 1902, the 10-year 1892 legislation, Geary Act, is going to expire. What to do? Here we go again. The 1902 legislation extends the exclusion laws indefinitely, consistent with the terminus of a treaty. So as long as the Gresham-Yang Treaty is in effect, this law is going to be backing it up. There was an attempt in the House of Representatives, a very, very serious attempt, to take all those administrative regulations that restricted Chinese activity and to codify them on the basis that an administrative regulation is just that. It's an administrative regulation, and a new administration comes in, could change the way the law is interpreted. So instead of allowing for that possibility, Congress tried to codify it, and it passed the House of Representatives in that form. At the same time that it passed the House of Representatives, there was included in the House bill a failed attempt to overturn landmark birthright citizenship cases. The big case was Wong Kim Ark versus United States in 1898. Wong Kim Ark was born in America to parents who were unable to become American citizens because they were born in China. They were in the United States. They couldn't naturalize. He went out of the country, tried to come back in. They tried to stop him. He said, "I'm an American citizen." They say, "What are you kidding me? You're Chinese. You're not an American citizen." He said, "I was born here." They say, "Let's test it." And so the birthright citizenship litigation, testing the meaning of that provision in the 14th Amendment, was a Chinese case, Wong Kim Ark versus US. And the court said, well, Constitution says you're born in America, you're an American citizen. He was born in America, he's an American citizen. Well, that didn't sit well in the House of Representatives. So in the House, they tried to establish through legislation language that would cause another test case to move forward and see if the Supreme Court would reconsider the breadth of birthright citizenship as it had decided under Wong Kim Ark. Why did it fail? It failed because the Senate did not go along with this approach in 1902. So instead, the Senate went along with something that basically just extended the law further. In conference, more or less, the Senate provision prevailed. And so the harsh provisions of the House bill, including the one challenging birthright citizenship, did not become law. But In 1904, China was dissatisfied with the Gresham-Yung Treaty, so they had an opportunity to get out of it after 10 years. They did. Now, again, there's no treaty that governs all of this. So we're back to the Angel Treaty. Congress said, not going there. So we're just going to take the 1904-02 law and we're going to extend it permanently out into the indefinite future. And there we are, permanent law by 1904. This is Senator William Stewart of Nevada, the guy who blocked the Sumner legislation in 1870. He was not in Congress continually for all those years, but he was back in the Senate in 1904. Nevada had sent him back. And when they extended the law permanently, he spoke on the Senate floor. And he said, if they had been allowed to be naturalized and become voters, there probably never would have been any exclusion. But then, he said, there would have been great trouble. So if you miss the connection between political rights and what can happen to you if you don't have any, Senator Stewart can connect the dots, and does here. China reacted very badly to the 1904 legislation. So Robert Zoellick, who was a former Undersecretary of State or Deputy Secretary of State, had written a book about major foreign policy decisions and so forth. And he said, this was a 2020 or 2021 book, he said that the reaction in China had been very, very bad. They basically provoked the first mobilization of a political campaign by Chinese around the world, anti-American boycotts. Theodore Roosevelt, who had signed this legislation into law, tried to mitigate the effects of the legislation by saying, well, you know, look, we have to be fair about how we administer this and all that kind of stuff. But as Zoellick said, the damage had already been done. So anti-American sentiment and anti-American boycotts were the aftermath of the legislation. China had to accept it, but it didn't accept it lying down. I want to talk for a little bit of time about the atmosphere behind this. This is a Congressman, John O'Neill of Missouri, writing in 1888, which was the year of the Scott Act. It's a presidential election year. Let's beat up on China. So a campaign does not appear to be complete without additional Chinese legislation. And that was true. This is a really interesting story. This person, who many people today have never heard of, was one of the most prominent Americans of the 19th century, James G. Blaine of Maine. Mr. Blaine came to Congress in 1863. He rose to become the Speaker of the House of Representatives. He hoped to be the Republican presidential nominee in 1880, did not get the nomination then, but did get it in 1884 and came within a whisker, so to speak, he's got a beard here, of becoming president of the United States. And later on, he was Secretary of State under 3 presidents. Major opposition to Chinese exclusion legislation, if it were to be found in the Congress, would be found in the Northeast, particularly among the remnants of the Abraham Lincoln Republican Party. And that, by the way, would include James G. Blaine of Maine, a Northeastern Republican, a remnant of the Abraham Lincoln Republican Party. But as opposed to other people in the same situation as he was, he wanted to be president. And he thought about those electoral votes on the West Coast. And so he broke from the Northeast Republicans and supported exclusion. And in the debate on the 1879 15 passenger bill, he makes this statement. We have this day to choose whether we will have for the Pacific Coast the civilization of Christ or the civilization of Confucius. Think about that. His idea is If we allow these folks to come in without restriction, they will flood the Pacific coast. White people will not go there. Then we won't have the civilization of Christ, we'll have the civilization of Confucius. And we don't want that. So they should not, in the first place, be allowed to become voters, to accumulate on the Pacific coast. And if you're not going to let them in and become part of the body politic, you should let them in altogether. Because if you let them in, but you don't give them full rights, then you will have on the Pacific coast a mass of angry, grievance-laden people who will not be good for the United States. So we won't treat them like other immigrants. We will say that they are basically unable to become appropriate citizens of this country. And if they cannot become a citizen, they shouldn't become an immigrant. Simple as that. That logic, which he was the first one to express in the congressional debates, was later born in other debates on these renewals and so forth. And more people came to express it. Not everybody in Congress took that position. This is Congressman William Rice, one of the other Northeastern Republicans in 1882, who spoke vigorously against exclusion legislation, just they didn't have the votes to stop it. This is a congressman from Illinois named Robert Hitt. As a young man, he had been a law clerk in Illinois for Abraham Lincoln. And now he's sitting in Congress talking about the Geary Act and this idea that you have to carry papers with you all the time, right? He's basically saying this policy should remind us of the days of slavery. And then there's this senator. His name is George Frisbee Hoar of Massachusetts. He had been in the House, came to the Senate, served in the Senate from 1877 to 1904 when he passed away. So thus, he was a senator during this entire era of Chinese exclusion policy. And he voted against it, voted against it, and against it again. Every time it came up, he opposed it. Now, Senator Hoar, in 1902, when the last major piece of legislation went through, was by then an elderly member. The debate raged on the Senate floor for a week as to what the bill ought to look like. Hoar didn't say a word. But just before the vote on final passage, he rose and he essentially said, my problem is not with the details of this bill. Do we want to have this kind of exclusion policy or that kind? My problem's not that. My problem is with the concept of the bill itself. It violates, he said, the Declaration of Independence. It violates the Constitution. It violates the promise of this country. Then he said, I hold that every human soul has its rights dependent upon individual personal worth and not dependent upon color or race, as this bill violates that principle. I am bound to record my protest if I stand alone. And then they took the vote. Here it is, 76 to 1. He stood alone. That vote and his record in general on this topic is the reason that I dedicated the book, Forbidden Citizens, to his memory. Henry Nathan was a two-term congressman from Massachusetts at the beginning of the 20th century who voted for the 1902 bill and said in approval what the legislation was all about. He explained it. Here's his idea. Well, you know, we don't let anybody and everybody into this country. If you are sick, you can't come in. If you're going to be a burden on the public debt, you can't come in. If you're a criminal, you can't come in. So he said, with everybody but the Chinese, we admit the people and we exclude the individuals. And if you're Chinese, not everybody is kept out. If you're a teacher, if you're a merchant, they can come in. So he said, with everybody else, we admit the people and exclude the individuals. With the Chinese, we admit the individuals and exclude the people. It was the best summary I ever found of the Chinese exclusion laws. So, Stewart and the naturalization ban. And now we come to the 1940s. Law has been in effect now on a permanent basis for 4 decades and on a semi-permanent basis for over 6 decades. But now America is a wartime ally of China fighting Japan. Madam Chiang Kai-shek makes a trip to the United States, 1942, 1943, travels around the country to stir interest for support of the Chinese war cause. And in the course of doing it, she speaks not only to many audiences in many cities, Los Angeles and New York and other places. She also comes to Washington. She speaks on the floor of the United States Senate, and then she goes to the House of Representatives, February the 18th, 1943. We have a short video of her doing this, which I am going to play for you, because I want you to understand the kind of reception Madam Chiang got in the Congress. Attitudes about the Chinese have now changed because we have the common enemy of Japan, and also because of certain cultural things that had happened in the intervening years, publication of Pearl Buck's Good Earth and other things that have softened attitudes toward the Chinese. So here she is speaking in the House of Representatives. In that year, President Franklin Roosevelt asked for repeal of the Chinese exclusion laws. The congressman that was given the responsibility to introduce the legislation came from the Pacific Coast, and that's why he had the responsibility. This is Warren Magnuson of Washington State, at first a House member and then a 6-term member of the US Senate from Seattle. So there is Maggie. He sponsors the legislation, the Magnuson Act, to repeal the Chinese exclusion laws. And the law goes through the Congress, first the House, then the Senate, and it was ready to go to President Roosevelt. And on December 17th, Franklin Roosevelt signs the repeal of the Chinese exclusion laws. This is a picture taken on that day of the president with his Secretary of Labor, Francis Perkins. That brings us to a more modern day, May 26, 2011. The resolutions that I mentioned at the outset were introduced in the House and in the Senate. In the House, the sponsor principally was Representative Judy Chu, who was then in her first term in the House, Judy Chu of California, and her Republican co-sponsor was Representative Judy Biggert of Illinois. In the Senate, the principal sponsor was Senator Scott Brown of Massachusetts, and his co-sponsor was Dianne Feinstein of California. Please note that Judy Chu and Scott Brown were at that time both freshman members of the minority party in their chambers. What do the resolutions do? They provide a synopsis of the historical facts, and I will say that the Senate resolution is even more complete than the House resolution on this subject. So if you want this all in one place, you pick up that Senate resolution And you can see it all in the preambular clauses, which are the whereas clauses that precede the resolve clause. They acknowledge Congress's role in harming the civil rights of Chinese persons. They express the regret of Congress for the passage of the Chinese exclusion laws. They express appreciation for Chinese and other immigrant contributions to the nation, and they affirm Congress's responsibility to protect the civil rights of all people, regardless of race or ethnicity. What do the resolutions not do? They didn't seek money. They didn't discuss persons of other races or ethnicities, although the anti-Chinese legislation later led to other restrictions on immigration. But we had to cabin this in somewhere, and so we stopped with the Chinese legislation and did not extend it to talk about other persons. It just did have a bearing on other persons. It did not commemorate actions that were not taken by Congress. There were many such actions taken by state and local governments, for example, much less private individuals. But Congress had done enough, I think, as you could see from this record, and we didn't talk about others. And it did not address the issue of illegal immigration. The Senate resolution passed on the evening of October 6, 2011. You're going to see Senator Harry Reid take this from the desk. It had been discharged by unanimous consent from committee and passed. And so it was a simple matter, but it really required unanimous consent to get it through, and it received unanimous consent. This is a simple proceeding, but underlying it all is this: if any one senator had objected to this for whatever reason, this would not have happened and the legislation would not have moved forward. It's not that it couldn't have moved forward some way other than by consent, it just wouldn't have. So to get it done, everyone had to agree. Here we go.
Laws against the Chinese in America, including the Chinese Exclusion Act. Without objection.
A few months later, in the House of Representatives, they consider it under a process called suspension of the rules, which means it needs just a 2/3 vote to pass. It got that. In fact, no one objected to it. Here is the proceeding in the House. You will see in the first place, Chairman Lamar Smith of the House Judiciary Committee, who brings us to the floor, and then comments from Representative Judy Chu.
Speaker, I first want to thank California Chair for introducing HRS 683, expressing the regret of the House for the passage of laws that adversely affect the Chinese in the United States, including the Chinese Exclusion Act. I know through conversations with several of my colleagues, including the ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee, that this is an important resolution for them and their constituents. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I rise and support House Resolution 683. First, I want to thank Chairman Lamar Smith and Subcommittee Chair Trent Franks of the Judiciary Committee for all the work on this resolution. I appreciate it so much. We have come together across party lines to show that no matter what side of the aisle we sit on, Congress can
make amends for the past, no matter how long ago those violations occurred. It is because we have worked together in a bipartisan way that we will make history today. Today, for the first time in 130 years, the House of Representatives will vote on a bill that expresses regret for the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, one of the most discriminatory acts in American history.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and agree to House Resolution 683? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the resolution is agreed to, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table.
And the final slide. This is also one of the most prominent Americans of the 19th century and someone not much heard of today. It's Hannibal Hamlin of Maine. Hannibal Hamlin of Maine was originally a Democrat in the Congress. He became a Republican when the party was founded as an anti-slavery party. And he was put on the ticket with Abraham Lincoln in 1860 and served as Abraham Lincoln's first vice president. In 1864, Republican managers at the convention, looking to broaden the base of the vote for Mr. Lincoln running for a second term, dropped Hamlin from the ticket and put Andrew Johnson of Tennessee on the ticket. Hamlin went back to Maine. Maine sent him back to the Senate. So he came back for 2 more terms starting in 1868. And he became, by the time he was done, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. It was his committee, that reported the original 1879 15-passenger bill. Now, he was against it, but his committee members were for it. So the best he could do basically was to get it reported from committee without recommendation, as opposed to we recommend it pass. But on the floor, Hamlin denounced the legislation, talked about all his objections to legislation of that kind, and then made this statement at the end of the speech. I shall vote against this measure, and I leave that vote the last legacy to my children, that they may esteem it the brightest act of my life. That day, he lost. When the Judy Chu resolution passed, I went with her into the old chamber of the House of Representatives, a place now called Statuary Hall. Every state in the country can have 2 statues. They're not all in Statuary Hall. They're scattered around the Capitol building, but the great collection of them, or the greatest collection of them, is in Statuary Hall, the old chamber of the House. And Hannibal Hamlin is there from Maine. I told Ms. Chu, never look at the statue the same way again, because this is a great man. In his day, he lost, but today we have redeemed his memory and his position. At the end of the day, I left the Capitol that evening by walking through Statuary Hall one more time. And I went up to the statue and I put my hand on his shoe, and I had 3 words for him. Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Senator. And thanks to all of you for your attention to this program. I hope you have found it of value. I certainly found it of immense value and personal satisfaction to work on it. And I wish you all well. Thanks very much.